Good afternoon. I'm Pastor Clark, and today we're going to do some Bible study. It's good to be with you. It's a beautiful day, beautiful weekend. I hope you had some chance to enjoy the outdoors and maybe in safe ways to connect with other humans. We had that chance this weekend, so I hope you had it too. All right, so this is the gospel reading that's coming up for this Sunday, the 21st. It's Matthew chapter 10. And I'm excited to dive into it. And first, I want to tell you a story. In the last couple of weeks, I've been preaching about kind of finding a gospel lens to look at the protests and movement for change and justice that have sprung up in around the country, really, and the result of long, hard work, but also somehow spontaneous and new. And I want to tell you a story of like what really was my first introduction to that kind of work. It was 2005. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, was having a church-wide assembly in Orlando, Florida. And I went with other seminary classmates and I to that assembly. We were not there to vote. We were there to advocate for change. And at that time, there had been since the beginning of the ELCA, but then especially in the 4 years, from 2001 to 2005, a conversation, a time of study, Bible study, and conversation about the church's policy to prohibit gay partnered clergy. So you could be gay and a pastor in the ELCA at that time, but you had to pledge to be celibate. And so I went to that 2005 church-wide assembly with friends. I was invited by friends. I probably would not have gone by myself to be part of the advocacy and movement for change in the ELCA, so that our policies would make it possible for partnered gay clergy. That's how we talked at the time, because there was no widespread legal gay marriage in the United States. So that was what I was there to be part of. And really, I was kind of a tag along. I wouldn't have gone. It wasn't my idea. So what did we do? So there was a big conference room where all of the business meetings happened, and we would sit or stand in the visitor section and pray and kind of keep vigil. Outside of those business sessions, we were also present in the hotel where the assembly was happening. We had a permanent room, like a smaller conference room, where we had a collection of stoles, rainbow stoles. That's what pastors wear. Those stoles, I wear those on Sunday. Kind of like a big scarf, a symbol of the office. And there we were available just in the hallways and during lunch and dinner times, just to talk and have conversation with people. That's where I had just an amazing conversation with a man whose name I don't remember and who I've never met since, who was gay, and just had a sense of empathy for people who resisted the change, saying, I know what it's like to lose my church. And so that his own experience of being excluded and to not have a place for him is what gave him the empathy to understand the people who did not want to make a change in church policy. So anyway, at that assembly, the reason why we were focused on that assembly in 2005 is because there was um, that 4 years, 4 intentional years of study and conversation was finally coming to a vote, and there were new policies on the table that the assembly was going to choose what to do. And so we wanted a bigger change than even what was on the table, and that vote came probably about 2/3 of the way through the week or 6 days that we were together for that assembly. And there were big, it was very contentious. There were big debates about even what the rules to the assembly were. Usually what takes is just a pro forma, 30-second vote on these are the rules governing this meeting. That took like hours and hours. And there were lots of times, lots of other like long just debate time, debate in the formal sense of, the green microphone, people who are speaking for the amendment or for the motion, and red mics, people who are speaking against, back and forth. And, there was a lot of what we perceived at the time. We were a group of people who were gay or lesbian, or their, friends and family and people who loved them, who that we experienced at the time as being pretty hateful. And so that was painful, but we just sort of stayed and watched and prayed. And then finally, about 2/3 of the way through the assembly came the vote, kind of the moment of truth. And the night before, we had a training. There was an organization called Soul Force, SOUL, Force, Soul Force, that was kind of helping us organize what would eventually be a protest. And I remember very clearly when they described what was going to happen the next day. If there, and we had a few options, a few contingency plans. If the assembly voted for the motion, what would we do? If the assembly voted against the motion, what would we do? And if the assembly voted against the motion to make a change in our church policies, we were going to break the rules of the assembly. We were going to leave the designated visitors section and enter the floor of the floor where all the voting was happening. And we were going to stand between the leader's podium and the rest of the assembly. There's probably 1,000, 1,200 people in this big conference center, and then on stage the presiding bishop and a few others. And so we had a training about what that was going to be like. We were pretty certain that motion was going to be voted against, and so in that case, they were like, here's going to be the line. If you cross the line, you need to be prepared to be arrested. We don't know what's going to happen or how the leaders in the assembly are going to respond, but you need to be prepared to be arrested if you cross the line. Now, what I didn't know and what I didn't fully appreciate at the time was all of the work, all of the relationship work, all of the planning work that went into that moment. The leaders of the organization were already had for months been in communication with the presiding bishop of the ELCA and the Conference of Bishops of the ELCA, so that everyone knew what was going to happen. They all had the plans. The presiding bishop knew that if the vote went this way, we would do that, and if the vote went the other way, we would do that. It was all choreographed. Not that the presiding bishop, Mark Hansen at the time, had a say in what we were going to do, but he knew what we were going to do so that he could plan what he was going to do. and all of the bishops, the 65 synodical bishops of the ELCA, knew what we were going to do. And they could communicate with their group that had come from their synod about what to expect. And again, it wasn't asking permission, but it was building relationship so that we knew each other and understand the motivations, what we were after, what our goals were mutually on both sides, and so that they would not be surprised. So when the assembly voted not to make a change in church policy, the group of about 100 of us, there were about 100 of us who decided to break the rules. Some of us didn't. Some of us remained in the visitors section, but we opened up the little, it's just like a rope barrier, and wearing our own rainbow stoles, we walked out in front of the assembly and we simply stood there. We didn't say anything. We didn't do anything other than stand there. I had a lot of anxiety before crossing the line. I mean, my values and the love of the people in my life who were gay and who had been harmed by the teaching of the church was real for me. A housemate in college who had attempted suicide a number of times because of the teaching of his church and the stance of his family. That was very real to me, and the conviction that I was responsible to him and to many others who I knew and loved, and that I was accountable to them. That was real for me. And, I'm not really much of a rule breaker myself. I've always been a quote unquote good kid. And so being worried about what would happen, the anxiety of not knowing, that was real. But I crossed the line, and it ended up being just this powerful experience of love, because what the presiding bishop did was to call for a pause and invite us to sing. The whole assembly, was used to actually singing hymns and songs just during warm-up times or cool-down times, or just taking little breaks to stand up and sing. That was just something that's part of a church-wide assembly before and since. And so as we stood up there and the assembly started to sing, there were people who were part of the voting members, the people who were just there to be part of the voting, who brought us hymn books, who brought the group chairs, because there were there was a woman who was 75 years old, a man who was in his 70s. We were of all ages, and some of us couldn't stand for very long, so they brought us chairs and hymnals, and in addition, there were people who were obviously supporting us with their, you could just read it on their faces, and it was just a really powerful experience of taking a stand and what we had hoped to accomplish. And I just earlier today had a conversation with somebody who was on the other side, who was not part of the protest, who was simply part of the assembly. Our goal was to put a face on what had simply been an abstract issue to that point. And to just with our bodies and with our faces say, this is about people. It's not about an idea. It's not about a concept. It's not about a theology. This is about people, human beings, and human beings who are hurting and who are harmed by this policy. And the assembly continued and went on to, also vote down so they voted not to make a change, and they also voted they voted against not making a change. It was very confusing, parliamentary procedure, et cetera, et cetera. So they basically decided that there needed to be a change, but they weren't willing to make that specific change at that time. But we also had a feeling like the nature of the conversation and the feeling in the room changed, even though the assembly didn't do what we had hoped they would do. That now people were making a connection that this was about people, and also starting to make a connection that this maybe the gospel was on the side of making a change rather than the Bible being, against making a change. That the time while we stood up there, I can't even remember how long it was, but most of that time I was just standing there weeping for love of the people I loved who were being harmed, and for the kindness and love that was being shown to us by the power of the moment and the feeling of, even though we could not, even though we could not do everything we wanted to do, and not everything we wanted to happen was happening, that we could make a difference, that we could do that in a way that was nonviolent and that was represented love, both for those who would have considered themselves enemies and for everyone else. And that has just that powerful experience has just gone on to shape so much of what why I invest in community organizing, what it can mean, what it looks like when it is done well. It's also represented what I hope for these current Black Lives Matter protests. I'm very moved by the images and stories of the protests where the police showed up, but not in riot gear, and took a knee along with the protesters and joined them, like in Newark, New Jersey, where I lived just 20 minutes from Newark for a long time. And I think that honestly, I think that's really resonant and important for this reading. So let's dive into this reading. And I think that I am going to read through it all the way once, and then stop and go back and kind of outline it in a sense, like just so we can, there's two ways of engaging this. One is just what's the basic meaning of the words, and then two, what is it saying, and then what is it saying to me specifically? What is God asking me to do, be, or change through this reading? So here it is, Matthew 10, starting with verse 24. Jesus said, "A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It's enough for the disciple to be like the teacher, and the slave to be like the master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them, because nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops, the rooftops. Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. Even the hairs of your head are counted. So do not be afraid. You are of much more value than many sparrows. Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny before my Father in heaven. I do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. Because I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Okay, so I just want to step through this reading and kind of sort of break it down in verses and reflect back what I'm convinced and convicted is what the just the plain meaning of the words are. So the first couple of verses, there's the disciples not like the teacher, and the whole Beelzebul thing. Beelzebul is like another name for the devil or the king of demons. Basically, in verse 24 and 25, Jesus is saying there is no avoiding resistance, criticism, and rejection. I couldn't, and neither can you. I mean, that's what Jesus is saying. If they've said that I'm possessed by demons, how much more will they malign you? Don't think that you are better than me or above me, that you somehow can figure out a way to do this without being attacked. There's just no way to do it. There's no way of avoiding it. I mean, that's certainly the experience of trying to change the church policies, that thankfully they are changed, and now married gay folks can be pastors in the ELCA, thanks to a lot of long, hard work. And, there was resistance, there was criticism, there was rejection. That was just part of the deal. You got to accept it. It was part of the deal for Jesus. There was resistance, criticism, rejection. He was killed for what he was saying and doing. That's just, so it's part of the deal. That's just part of what means being a disciple means, what following Jesus means. And that's our theme for these days. Follow me, Jesus' invitation. All right, and then we move into another section of verse 26 to 31. And, there's probably other ways to break these verses down and kind of fit them into an outline of the message that Jesus is trying to communicate. This is the way I've done it. You can do it differently. But from verse 36 to 31, the message is do not be afraid. I mean, so have no fear of them is verse 36. And verse 31 ends with, where is it? So do not be afraid. So those, whenever words are repeated or phrases are repeated like that, that's a huge sign that here's a section that's trying to communicate that very thing. Do not be afraid. And in those section of verses, so at first Jesus says there's no way of avoiding rejection and resistance and criticism. So don't be afraid. There's just no way to avoid it. Don't be afraid. And then he kind of has 3 points of like why. Why should we not be afraid? And the first one is this business about nothing is covered that won't be uncovered. So essentially Jesus is saying the truth will come out. No matter who is resisting it, the truth will come out. And so speak on it, speak for it, speak toward it. Be speaking the truth, because the truth will come out, even if there are others who are trying to hide it and cover it up, keep it a secret, perhaps unintentionally, simply by their opposition to it. So it's about the power of the truth. Trust in the power of the truth is point number 1, why we should not be afraid. 1, there will be success in the end because the truth is powerful. The second one is that your soul depends on it. And your soul is safe as long as you're doing the work. Your integrity is safe as long as you're doing the work. That's what, this verse 28, don't fear those who can kill the body, but those who can kill the soul. I mean, I know I'm capable of harming and killing my own soul, and putting myself in hell. And certainly living a life that is not in alignment with my true values, that is not accountable to the people who are being harmed around me, or honest to my own suffering, that's hell. That's a way to kill the soul. So that even even though they could send you to jail or they could harm you or what have you. I mean, that's what I see. And I have people. I've got people in D.C. And they say they're afraid of the police. It doesn't matter what you do. They're going to respond in a violent way, and you have to be prepared for that. But there are things worse than getting beat up, than getting pepper sprayed, than what have you. So that's the second point. Your soul is safe while you're doing the work, while you're staying true to your values, while you're staying true to Jesus and his teaching. Then the third point is about the sparrow, and brings to mind the song, His Eye is on the Sparrow, right? That's the old song written in 1905, God's eyes on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. We belong to God. That's ultimately the message, and God cares very deeply about us. And so that's another reason not to be afraid. 3 reasons. Don't be afraid in doing this work that is following Jesus and serving the truth and serving love. The truth will out. Your soul is safe while you're doing the work, and God's got God's eye on you. God loves you and cares for you. So that's the section, do not be afraid. Then in verse 32 and 33, God knows those who do the work. If you're doing the work, you're known by God, is essentially the message I take away from that. And I used this quote a couple of weeks ago in preaching, but here it is, another quote from Thomas Merton. Everyone is shadowed by an illusory person, a person who's an illusion, a false self. This is the man, now this is Thomas Merton is writing as a man, but please translate for yourself. This is the man I want myself to be, but who cannot exist, because God does not know anything about him. And to be unknown of God is altogether too much privacy, says Thomas Merton in his book, New Seeds of Contemplation. That's how I take those 2 verses. Everyone who acknowledges me before others, I will acknowledge. Basically, when we're living into our true selves, the self that has been created by God and is known by God, then God knows us. Otherwise, trying to be somebody else is not going to work out. And I think whenever we're being our true selves and really living according to the values that we have, when we know what we know and feel what we feel, and we express it and act on it, then that all inevitably brings us into criticism and resistance from others. But when we're in that, when we're following Jesus in that way, in that truth of our true selves and our true calling, and in the true message of the gospel, the movement towards love and justice, care for others, that then we are known by God. We're in the light, and God can see us and know us. Okay, so then the next couple of verses in 24 to 26. Yeah, 34 to 36, I'm sorry. Again, Jesus is saying conflict is inevitable. Don't think that I've come to bring peace. I haven't come to bring peace, but the sword. Jesus is trying to wake us up, I think, to the fact, and uses language that's pretty shocking, maybe. But the basic message is there's no way from here to full love and full justice existing in the world where everyone is really cared for. There's no way to that without conflict. There just isn't. Sorry to break it to you, is kind of what I hear Jesus saying. Let me take a drink here. And then Jesus goes so far as to say, this conflict will be painful, and it will divide even your own family. I mean, maybe even in a way more than today. Probably the family was everything in Jesus's time. It was your social security. It was your economic prospects. It was everything. And so a break with one's family, a break in one's family, was a really traumatic thing, and a big part of what just historically was happening. To join the movement of Jesus was to step away from an allegiance to your family as the primary thing. It's part of the reason that family language is so full of the church language. My brother and my sister, in the faith, my brother and sister in Christ. That's family language, in a sense that is, if God is absolute, then everything else is relative. This is leading into the next verses as well, 37 to 38. But if God is absolute, then even our families are relative. The things that we have rooted our lives in, that's relative too. God's the only absolute. And so and in fact, I mean, in my own story, my dad, he watched the 700 Club, and, I remember many segments of that when I was a kid that was just very hateful against gay people, equating gay people and Nazis, and this whole secret gay agenda. Like, that was what was proclaimed on this quote unquote Christian television show, like every night or every week or whatever. So I knew full well that to participate in that protest meant a separation with my dad, meant stepping away from what my dad valued, and having to trust that, if my dad really loves me, he'll keep loving me even though we disagree. And thank God that was true, even though I know is not always true. So yeah. To go deeper into what I think 37 and 38 is all about is that I would set aside the language of worthiness. I think if Jesus was addressing us today, I think we have evolved, our awareness and consciousness and spirit have evolved to a point where he wouldn't talk about worthiness, but instead would talk about our true and false selves. That's how I interpret this. It's not that we're not worthy of Jesus. It's that our false self clings to the status quo. That's just the way it is. The status quo in our family, the status quo at work, just the status quo in our church, in our governments, just whatever. The false self clings to the status quo. And if you're clinging to that status quo, you're not clinging to Jesus. Clinging to Jesus will just inevitably lead to these separations with people who we depend on and who love us. That the true self always goes through the cross, which is, nothing. It's just everything Jesus has been talking about so far is resistance and criticism and rejection, ultimately suffering because of it, and loss. All on the way to love and justice and hope and all the good stuff, obviously, but there's no way to avoid it. That's what Jesus is saying. There's no way to avoid it. I think he's just making that crystal clear as he can by putting it in terms that people would really feel, because of the position of the family and society at that time and place. Okay, so that takes us up to the last verse. Verse 39, Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. An idea, a verse, saying that's repeated by Jesus many times in the Gospels, not just in Matthew, but it really seems like a summary statement here of everything Jesus was talking about. And I certainly think it speaks to, and I've talked about this before, the two halves of life, a concept, Richard Rohr's concept, and I think it's right here. The first half of our lives, and this is not necessarily about age. It's not the first 30 years versus the last 30 years. We all come to this at different times. If at all, some of us live our whole lives in the first half of our lives, is about finding something, building a life, creating something. Who am I? And who will go with me? That's the first half, the preoccupation of the first half of life. And then in the second half of life is a lot of letting go of that life, whether it's just because of the way love and suffering, how when death visits us, lead to a lot of letting go. But here what Jesus is saying is that if we're following Jesus, there's a lot of letting go, even to the point of letting go of our own lives. Yeah. So I just, like I said, I put all of this in the context of that experience of protest, not just protest, but working for a better world, organizing for a better world. That's what I see Jesus doing. And when it is one that is as committed to love of enemies as it is to love of people who are being harmed, including ourselves, then it really is a movement that is in Jesus' name. And it is a losing our lives for the sake, for Jesus' sake. And the hopeful message here of Jesus is that there's another side to it. There's a finding that happens on the other side of it. And I can certainly say everything that I was afraid of losing as I crossed that line, that was the line between safety and the possibility of being arrested. I really did find something on the other side of that. I found a calling. I found love. I found power, and I'm still living in that. What I found on the other side of that loss, what seemed like it could be a loss. So, all of the peace and power of the Holy Spirit be with you. And I hope that just spend a little extra time on your own reflecting on what is this passage inviting you to do, be, or change. What is this present moment and the light that this gospel reading sheds on this present moment, inviting you to do, be, or change, whether it's pandemic or protest or whatever else is happening in your life. All right, so blessings and peace. Take care.